How's it going, everyone, and welcome back to the SFS channel. My name is Gavin, and today we're going to be talking about some wide receivers that I prefer in each round, that being rounds 1 through 8 of draft boards this season in our 12-team league. So these are just some names to keep your eye out for. I'm not a huge fan of going in on the RB0 strategy and loading up on these players early because just like quarterbacks in 1 QB leagues, I think that wide receivers are some of the most expendable players in fantasy and some of the easiest to stream, not only off the waiver wire, but to find really great positional depth at late on the board. So talking again about my favorite players at each position, we're going to dive into each of these names and talk about a little bit of their fantasy situations. So if you're new around here, make sure to head down and subscribe to the channel and turn that bell on so you're never late for a new episode here. Also, if you want to be involved in some subscriber mock drafts that I have coming out here once or twice every week, head down and join the free community Discord in the description of this video. Without further ado, let's hit that intro and we're going to get right in to today's wideouts. Here we go. So I've got pretty much 2 players in every round here to talk about. So 16 players, except for the fact that in round 1, I only have 1 player here because ADP only has 2 players going in the first round of 12-team leagues, and that second player is just barely hanging on to the fringe of the first round. So if I were to pick a wide receiver in the first round, which is something I typically don't love doing, I would take Tyreek Hill at this moment in time. He finished as the wide receiver 2 last fantasy season, and for the most part of this offseason, he was, again, the wide receiver 2, but rightfully so, with all the Aaron Rodgers drama, Devonta Adams has slipped out of that wide receiver 1 grasp, and he's moved back into that wide receiver 2 territory. It just came out and reportedly that my Packers offered Aaron Rodgers a 2-year extension that would have made him the highest paid player in the National Football League, to which he declined that offer and continues his holdout. So not great for the Packers, not great for Devonta Adams, because obviously as a pass catcher, we would love to see him have the best and most optimal quarterback play available. So Tyreek, he's got the best quarterback in pro football, a really great touchdown ceiling. He's a one-touch scoring threat, one of the fastest players in the league. His overall ADP right now is 8.7, so he's nearly the 9th pick in the draft, and that's basically where he's falling more often than not. It's more so being picked with the 9th pick than the 8th pick, obviously, as he swings on the second half of that in between 8 and 9 draft position marker. But Tyreek Hill, again, not a huge fan of drafting wide receivers in the first round, but if I had to take one, Tyreek Hill would be the name off the board for me. Into round 2 here, Stefon Diggs is my favorite wide receiver to draft at this spot on the board. His ADP right now is 15th, so he's going relatively close to the top of that second round. And the simple reason for liking Diggs here is that he could easily finish as the wide receiver 1 overall. There's no reason that his ceiling is any lesser than that of a Tyreek Hill. His floor might even be safer because he's being targeted at such an elite clip. He saw 168 looks in his first season with Josh Allen as his quarterback last year in Buffalo. The value you're getting here is pretty darn good. And I think that while I'm still not overall locked into drafting a wide receiver in the second round of fantasy drafts this season, you certainly can't go wrong by picking Diggs here. And again, when you can get a player with the upside of finishing at the number 1 overall spot at his respective position, there's no reason not to take that investment here, and you're getting him at a draft price much cheaper than that of Tyreek Hill. So I get the elite upside. He led the National Football League in yards last year, and I get the quarterback play in Josh Allen to give him those deep downfield targets, which we love to see. Calvin Ridley's the other wide receiver that I'm the biggest fan of drafting here. It was a tough choice between him and DeAndre Hopkins for this second round role. But what mainly makes me like Ridley a bit more is the discounted draft price. He's going at virtually one of the last picks in the second round, nearly the 23rd overall draft pick, and there's obviously 24 picks total within the first 2 rounds of the draft. So you're giving me a player who I think can be a top 5 wideout. We see he finished as wide receiver 4 last year, as like the wide receiver 7 off the board right now. And when there's guys like A.J. Brown going ahead of him, I just can't get behind that. Justin Jefferson's highly talented, but his draft price is a little bit higher up there as well. Ridley just gives me the ceiling I'm looking for with a really great price here. No Julio Jones in the Atlanta offense this year, so I think that his potential to see even more than 143 targets that he had in 2020 is there. Kyle Pitts comes into this offense, but he's young, needs to get his legs underneath him. So Calvin Ridley's a great pick here. I think he's got a great floor and ceiling, and I can absolutely get behind drafting him in the late second round. We move into the third round here. I'm going to move pretty fast through these two players, actually, because if you've been sticking around here on the channel for a while, I talk a whole lot about Keenan Allen and the next name up here, Allen Robinson. The old Allen squared combo. These two would just have an incredibly awesome floor. And when we talk about Keenan Allen having Justin Herbert throwing him the ball, I mean, he's had so many 150 target seasons that it's becoming quite astounding to me. I believe he has 3 of them, and then his other season is 147 targets. So he's hovering right around that territory every year. He's one of the most thrown to players in the league, and he absolutely deserves that credibility and trust from his quarterbacks because he's simply an elite route runner, dependable. He catches passes, gets down, finds the hole in the zone defense. A really, really consistent player. And for fantasy teams, he's a top 10, fantasy wide receiver option, and you can get him here in the mid-third round. So a great value and a player you want on all counts this season. And then Allen Robinson here is just a tick lower for me, but it's relatively the same situation here. The last 2 seasons, he's cracked over 150 targets, and you give me the best quarterback play I think he might have ever seen in his career, which seems pretty sad considering Andy Dalton might be his QB for half the year. But Justin Fields comes in and I think immediately unlocks the upside and the ceiling that we've all been waiting for Allen Robinson for years now. So again, a top 10 wide receiver on my big board for this fantasy season, an absolute gem to find in the late third round of fantasy drafts. There's no reason that A-Rob can't produce big-time numbers for us this year. The fourth round becomes a bit tricky for me. I don't love the players at this draft spot, but I think Chris Godwin's a player I can get behind right now. His floor is safer than that of Mike Evans, who is going earlier than him in the fourth round. Mike Evans is going relatively close to one of the first couple picks in the third round, whereas Chris Godwin's falling a bit to the later fourth round. He actually was targeted on a higher clip than Mike Evans was last season, and that is with Chris Godwin missing some games. So I think he's got, again, that nicer floor. Tom Brady looked to him a lot in the end zone last season, as he did Mike Evans, but I think that Chris Godwin has a more dependable clip that he can turn over year, whereas Mike Evans' touchdown production was such a massive involvement of his fantasy value that I don't know if that is so consistently producible on a year-to-year basis, So Godwin also, Bruce Arians has talked about him as a player that doesn't come off the field in this offense. He plays kind of that Larry Fitzgerald role from the Arizona Cardinals, where Arians used to coach, that he sits him down in the slot and he runs basically every route in the book and just finds the opening in the coverage. And he's just a really reliable threat. And if you're going to pick a receiver here who has borderline top 12 upside, I don't think that Chris Godwin's ceiling is all that amazing anymore, considering the fact that the Bucks, might be blowing the brakes off teams in the fourth quarter this year and won't be passing the ball late. I still think that he has the potential to give us some wide receiver 1 games this season and be a good enough option in this offense. And then the next guy up here is Ceedee Lamb. And similar to the Bucs situation, the Cowboys have 2 wide receivers in the fourth round here as well. And I would argue that as a player who's being picked 3 or 4 spots later than his teammate Amari Cooper, we haven't seen the best production or anything close to that out of Ceedee Lamb this season. And with Dak Prescott coming back, things can only get better. I think that him and Cooper will both have incredibly productive ceilings, but I think that Lamb's ceiling is just as good of that as Amari Cooper's is, and maybe, just maybe, he can overtake him in targets this season and have an even better floor. I think that these are both, regardless of how many looks they see, very, very productive players who can be very efficient with their touches. But Lamb was pretty darn amazing in the red zone last season. I see a Cooper as more of a player who's going to give you run after catch ability. And his touchdown value and his production more so comes off of running straight down the field on fade routes and making toe drag catches on deep balls. So if Lamb can give me more of that route running out of the slot role he's playing right now for the Dallas offense, give me more post corner routes, more out routes, slants in the end zone for those touchdowns, that might ultimately net us some better fantasy production. Again, although I do think these are both incredibly good players, Lamb also comes at a discounted draft price as well. So it was a tough decision for me to make that Godwin and Evans choice and this Lamb and Cooper choice, as they are all going in the 4th round here. But I had to choose one of them, and so I think it's very fair if you were to disagree with me on any of those points. But that's just how I see this season playing out. Moving into the 5th round, I actually really, really like these two options here. Give me some Tyler Lockett as the wide receiver 8 finisher here, again, going in the 5th round. I talked about him in my last mock draft. He can go punch for punch with any fantasy option in terms of his upside at the wide receiver position. Him and Russell Wilson have a chemistry like almost no other player does in the league right now. They've been together for years now, and they're just on the same page. We've seen them make some of the most incredible tight window throw-in catches where Lockett, there's that one play against the Rams when it literally seems like the most improbable play ever, that he toe drags in the back corner of the end zone, literally doesn't even look back for the ball, but just sticks his hands out and catches a touchdown pass. These two guys just make magic happen, and he was hurt a lot last year, used as a decoy in this offense, and DK Metcalf ultimately came out and thrived during that stretch. But Tyler Lockett can be a top 12 fantasy receiver, and he's not the flashiest pick in the world, but I do think his upside is a lot greater than a lot of people give him respect for. So I won't be sleeping on him this season. I think he's got the chance to be a very awesome weapon for us in fantasy this year. And then Diontae Johnson, where conversely, I think Lockett gives us an elite ceiling. Diontae Johnson gives us a pretty dang good floor. He finished as wide receiver 21 last year, had 144 targets in this Pittsburgh offense, and he kind of plays that Antonio Brown role. And there's still 2 other talented players in the offense with him, the 2 TikTokers, Juju Smith-Schuster and Chase Claypool. But I think Diontae is the player we can count on to see more opportunities on a per-game basis. And he might have actually saw more targets and more looks last season had he not gotten injured literally within the first couple minutes of a few games last year. So there was some production left on the table. He did have drop issues too, which kind of held him back at points last season. But he's getting the looks. The trust is being shown between him and Ben Roethlisberger, where he just keeps throwing him the ball, play in and play out. So I think that we can count on Johnson to once again this fantasy season. Although the other players, particularly a Chase Claypool who's moving into year 2, whereas he might get better, I think that Diontae Johnson will remain a constant for this team. And if I had to pick a guy who would kind of be the afterthought and the player that gets left behind in the dust and sees a reduction in his 2021 output as compared to his 2020 season, I would pick Juju Smith-Schuster for the reasons that he just wasn't an efficient player last year. They re-signed him only on a 1-year deal, and they just don't have very much commitment to him moving forward. So Johnson and Claypool over Smith-Schuster for me in 2021. Moving into 6th round wide receivers that I am a big fan of. Give me some Ja'Marr Chase here. I think that for a player who is a rookie wide receiver, he has the best chance to finish as a top 24 option of any of the players drafted this year. We'll get into another rookie wide receiver that I love later down the board, later on in this episode, obviously. But Ja'Marr Chase, you pair him with his former college quarterback, who they have all of their accolades at LSU. They won the national championship. Ja'Marr Chase won the Biletnikoff Award, being the nation's best wide receiver. He did take the year off last season. That's a little bit of a red flag, a little bit of a ding on his fantasy profile this season. Maybe he comes out a bit rusty, but if Ja'Marr Chase goes over 1,000 yards, 6 to 8 touchdown receptions, 100-plus targets, I don't see any reason why he can't finish as a top 24 option. And again, he's already got pre-built chemistry with his quarterback, which is something almost unheard of for NFL players. Like, this is We actually saw this happen twice just in this draft class, actually 3 times with the Alabama quarterbacks and receivers and whatnot, where Tua and Jalen Waddle are pairing back up. Jalen Hurts and Devonta Smith are reuniting, and now Chase and Joe Burrow from LSU. This doesn't happen every day where you've already got a pre-built relationship with your quarterback from your college days. I think every once in a while we see former high school quarterback and wide receivers pair back up, but in terms of doing it at the next level in college, that's pretty impressive. And so for Ja'Marr Chase this season, with all the tools, all the traits he has, I love that situation for this season. And then Brandin Ayuk, probably the most impressive wide receiver on the 49ers roster. I was a huge Deebo Samuel fan, still am, but in terms of fantasy, I got to give it up to Brandin Ayuk. I think he's just a better player all around, especially as a pure wide receiver than Deebo Samuel is. Both of them are really, really good near the line of scrimmage, after the catch, explosive players who can be used in the wide receiver run game. But I think that when we start moving into routes 10, 15, 20 yards downfield, Brandin Ayuk is the better player at that area. So maybe we give Deebo a little bit of grace. He was injured last season. Maybe he's better at the line of scrimmage than Ayuk is. But in terms of where I want my targets to be, I want the ones that Brandin Ayuk is getting. I want them to be 10, 15 yards downfield, beating defensive backs where there's no safety help. Give me that quick touchdown, efficient fantasy scoring. So Ayuk showed us a very impressive outing last season. Didn't have great quarterback play most of the year. Jimmy Garoppolo was injured. You're putting in like C.J. Beathard and Nick Mullins, I believe, started a game or two for them last season. So it was a disaster, and Ayuk remained one of the most consistently best fantasy producers down the stretch of last year with his touchdowns and quality yardage output. So give me Ayuk, and then Robby Anderson here as my 7th round name off the board here. People don't realize Robby Anderson out-targeted DJ Moore by 20 looks last season, and that is with Teddy Bridgewater under center for the Panthers in 2020. That's a significant marker for, I believe Robby Anderson is a former undrafted player. DJ Moore is a former first-round pick and a very talented player in his own right. And actually, DJ Moore was one of the best players at winning contested grabs last season. So this is no thing to take lightly here that Robby Anderson is producing this elite of numbers. He had 138 targets for the Panthers last year. And I wouldn't be shocked, even though he's in a contract season this year, maybe long-term he isn't around with the Panthers for much longer. But he's reuniting with his former quarterback from the Jets, Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold is the new quarterback for the Carolina Panthers offense this season, and he very well, might throw the ball more to Robby Anderson than we would expect for the second year in a row. So you're telling me that a player who was literally a wide receiver 1 for most of last season, he barely finished as a wide receiver 2 because that offense fell into shambles at the end of last season, but he might potentially put up these numbers again. He might potentially be a top 24 wide receiver again. He was the wide receiver 23 in 2020, and he could do that for the second year in a row. So Robby Anderson's not a flashy pick. Again, he's a player I think is being slept on. So if you can get this target volume and the field stretching ability that he possesses, I mean, he was one of the best deep threats in the league, even with his time as a New York Jet. That offense was just so bad, he was never able to truly hit his fantasy ceiling. He now has a situation to do that in Carolina. So don't sleep on Robby Anderson this year. He is absolutely a quality sleeper pick and one of my favorites to go after in the 7th round. And then Devonta Smith here is my last player in the 7th round of the draft board. This is the other rookie wide receiver that I could see finishing as a top 24 performer. The analysis here is simple. The Eagles don't have another option in this offense that can truly soak up a number 1 target load outside of Devonta Smith. When I watch Devonta, the thing that I see the most from him, and you can go back and watch my Jalen Waddle versus Devonta Smith video, I talked about some potential comps for these two players. And when I watch Devonta Smith, what I see is Stefon Diggs. I see a tall, long, lanky wide receiver who is very good at running routes, can stretch the field, stops on a dime on comeback routes, slant routes. He does it well at all areas of the field. So The Eagles are looking for that type of player. Dallas Goedert is a nice safety blanket as a tight end option, and Jalen Reagor can stretch the field, but they don't have a guy to just run their 10 to 12 yard route tree, and that's what Devonta Smith can do. He's going to be the safety blanket for Jalen Hurts this season when Dallas Goedert inevitably probably gets injured again, because we've seen that a lot lately. And I just think the upside is there. Devonta Smith makes the big plays. He has the clutch gene. He did it at Alabama, caught game-winning touchdown passes, won the Heisman Trophy, for crying out loud. The Heisman Trophy winners, by all means, are not always the best NFL players, but when you cut the tape on, Devonta Smith's tape is pretty darn impressive. So I don't have too many worries about him other than that size and his durability concerns. But moving into the 8th and final round of wide receivers for today's video, 2 names left up on the board here. Will Fuller, a new Miami Dolphin, is my first name up on the list here. Let's be honest, Will Fuller would not be being drafted in the 8th round had he not gotten suspended. It's that simple. He was undisputably a wide receiver 1 producer while he was a Texan and legally able to play football games last year. We still don't know what the substance was that he was taking, but he was by no means a target hog. He was the number 1 option for Deshaun Watson in that Texans offense, but it's not like he was coming out here and getting just grossly large target shares in that system. He only had 6.8 targets per game as a Houston Texan, and in the 11 starts he only had 75 targets. So coming into Miami, I'm not too concerned that having Jalen Waddle there, having Devontae Parker there is going to hinder him too much, because in terms of his ability to produce as a perimeter player, I think he walks in and is instantly the best wideout on this team. Maybe Jalen Waddle breaks out midseason, maybe he doesn't. But I've seen Will Fuller do it in the past, and when you tell me all he needs to do is run seam and fly routes downfield and hope that Tua can get him the ball, I'll take my chances there. So, I mean, this is pretty low draft investment for a player who was putting up such good numbers last year. And again, a main factor of that was that he was cashing in touchdowns on those deep balls, but the explosive ability and the ceiling is here, and that's what we like to see. So pick your safer wide receiver options earlier on in the draft board if that's what you want to do here. But you could literally have yourself a situation where this is the 8th round. This could be your 3rd wide receiver off the board. You could be starting Will Fuller in the flex by midseason. And again, maybe he doesn't hit the heights that he did last year because the quarterback play is a downgrade. And I think there's more target competition in Miami this year than there was with the Texans last season. But I just showed you, he doesn't need to have the lion's share of the offense in order to have a good season. And he produced in previous years with DeAndre Hopkins on the field. So don't sleep on Will Fuller here. I think he'll be better than we realize and better than we expect for him this season. And then last but not least, Brandin Cooks. I put him in a video last week. This is an easy one for me. The Texans need to throw the ball to stay in games. Their defense is so bad. Their offense, their roster, everything is so bad. They're going to be losing pretty much every game this season. Maybe they sneak 1 or 2 out this year, but they're going to be trailing in the 4th quarter. High passing volume. It's that simple. They're going to have to throw the ball all over the yard to stay in games. He had 119 targets with Will Fuller on the field last year. Obviously, Deshaun Watson was the number 1 QB on that team, but Brandin Cooks wasn't the number 1 wide receiver on that team last year. So he's going to be an elevated player and have an elevated role in that team in 2021. And if you can simply just suck up the fact that maybe Tyrod Taylor and Davis Mills won't give him as many good looks as a Deshaun Watson did last year, but the looks will be there, this is going to be a productive pick for you. And if he stays healthy, he's gotten tossed around. I talked about this in the last video as well. He's gotten beaten up, banged, and bruised throughout his time in the NFL because he's a smaller guy. He got blindsided pretty viciously in the Super Bowl a few years back, and he ultimately got knocked out of that game, I think. But nonetheless, this is a player who's going to put up some pretty good garbage time yardage. And if you haven't learned anything from Kirk Cousins in fantasy football, the stats don't care what quarter it was that you produced those numbers. There you have it. Those are my favorite wide receivers on the draft board in rounds 1 through 8 of 2021 fantasy football. It was 15 names. We tossed a lot of people out there and went over a lot of players. So by any means, if you've got any questions, want me to talk about some other guys on the board, down in the comment section below, just shoot me your questions. I'll get back to you guys as well. And don't forget to join that free community Discord. So thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you tomorrow for the next installment of the Friday Fade series. And I'll see you then. Peace out.